Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together.
All right, so I am sitting here and I am talking to Tyler Winter. And Tyler, for everybody listening, can you go ahead and introduce yourself so we can get to know you a little better?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I am a founding member and a director of the nonprofit Native Fish for Tomorrow, and we're a consumptive conservation organization that's particularly focused on our native warm water, for the most part, species that have been historically maligned as rough fish or junk fish, or every state has their own title, some sort of derogatory category. But we're focused on working with these native fish because it's the lowest hanging conservation fruit, like it's the lowest hanging, right? To go from unlimited limits to some limit. Because we can't manage native and invasive fish the same. That's not scientific. It's not sustainable. And so it's a really simple conservation target. And to just go from like unlimited harvest, and to promote these fish as a resource.
Yeah. So what? Why would somebody want an unlimited harvest on certain fish and not? I mean, other than like say they are destructive. What's the purpose?
It's honestly, it's an accident of history. In Minnesota, we've been making some progress, and like we just had the no junk fish bill, and that's requiring the DNR to have a report to figure out how to separate these regulations of native and invasive fish. And it's going to take this report because this law, this phrase rough fish, has been on the books in Minnesota since 1907. And in the beginning, it included yellow perch, turtles, like all sorts of things. And so it's just been this catch-all, right? Yeah. And they things have come off the list over time. Somebody noticed that turtles are not a fish. So they came off the rough fish list. And then yellow perch, they decided were a game fish. So they came off. And then a couple years ago, they took lake whitefish and eel pout and lake herring off because they were, really become like big ice fishing targets. And I think that helped get people thinking a little bit about like, well, what is this? What is this list? Well, it's just this catch-all thing where there hasn't been enough time, effort, interest to actually reform this. But over the last almost 120 years now, this phrase has gotten worked into Minnesota's laws and statutes in so many different weird places that it's literally going to take probably a couple more years just to unwind all of this stuff. Like there are rules that require culverts and bridges to allow passage of fish, right? Because we all know fish passage is a major detriment to fish assemblages into ecosystem health. Except that they put in there that it doesn't have to allow that if the stream only has rough fish, or that it's designed if the structure is intended to block rough fish, which is something like that's actually intended. When they wrote that, it was actually intended to be allow for the stopping of common carp, which is an invasive species. But they just used that rough fish phrase because it was already in statute. And so we have to literally, before we can do other necessary changes and do promoting and actual conservation work, we just have to unwind this phrase from all these administrative rules and statutes where this phrase rough fish has been used indiscriminately.
Yeah.
And so now we have these, rules where, there is no limit on common carp and big mouth buffalo, but they don't say buffalo, they just say buffalo because they don't need you to think about the fact that there's 3 different species in Minnesota.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Which then gets into gets complicated when you realize actually if you actually read the fine print of the fishing regulations, you have to go all the way to page 34 of the Minnesota fishing regulations to find out that one of those species of buffalo is actually threatened. You're actually not allowed to harvest it at all. which
But
sort
how
of,
would you know that, right? Yeah.
how would you know that? Because on page 12, it just says buffalo. And that kind of leads to the problem, like this underlying problem of this category. These fish, mainly suckers. There's 17 species of suckers in Minnesota, but then also your ancient fishes, your gar, your bowfin, freshwater drum, some of these oddball species, mooneye, goldeye. Um, you've got all this diversity, right? And they don't get any attention until somebody in like the non-game department, who's in charge of threatened, conserving threatened species, realizes that they're not showing up in surveys. And so then they go from unlimited and unmanaged to protected.
Yeah.
And now, but it's like it's from like Animal House, like double secret protection, right? Where it's like they're protected, but nobody's told they're protected.
Right.
Right. So like double secret protected. They're on double secret probation. And so I see a shocking number of black buffalo in Minnesota, like on Instagram, that have been, killed. Right. Because nobody ever considered that they would even encounter a black buffalo if they even knew that it was a separate species or that it was a native species. And so you can't actually have, the fine print on page 34 doesn't do you any good if people don't even know that there is a species there to protect.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the insidious things about this rough fish idea, is that it kind of it short circuits the normal stakeholder-led conservation, because you can't be a stakeholder for something you don't know exists. And if you only see this unlimited limit, you may get the wrong idea that they are literally unlimited. Well, if there's anything we've learned from history of fisheries management, it's that that's not true, right? If we can drive Atlantic salmon to the edge of extinction and we can deplete tuna in the ocean, we can certainly overharvest a buffalo. So that's like this insidious knock-on effect, where you have to you have to tell people that they exist. And then sometimes I have actually been in arguments with people to convince them that they are actually not a carp. And then I have to start saying scientific names, and be a real nerd about it, and kind of a jerk. And, that's not a great way to.
So if it's not actually a carp, then what are they? So let's kind of talk about that.
Yeah, so suckers are that's the family Catastomidae. And so there are at least 78 different species of suckers in the United States. And 78 species worldwide, 77 of them are found in North America. And also because they're haven't been a popular game fish, they actually haven't been moved around. Unlike bass or trout or something like that. Walleyes are invasive out west or something like that. Nobody was actually stalking black buffalo anywhere. Right. So they're not invasive anywhere, because to be invasive, you kind of have to be popular, at least temporarily. Somebody has to want you to move you. So these fish, the buffalo, the suckers, whatever, those are all just members of the family Catastomidae. They separated from the minnows, which is where the carp belong, 90 million years ago. That's the same time as bats and mammals that became primates diverged. So they're really not related at all. So, and then some of these other fish that are in these other fish categories or rough fish categories can be even weirder than that. The mooneye and goldeye, they diverged from all other types of fish 190 million years ago. That's the same time marsupials split from regular mammals. So barely even except for the fact they all have fins, right? It's like you wouldn't even put them in the same fish category, except they're fish. So there's a lot of diversity there. But the native ones, none of those native ones are carp, but they're often regulated and managed like they're carp.
Okay. So the mooneye and the goldeye, I don't even think I've ever even seen such species, or maybe I have.
Oh yeah.
I don't know.
You probably know. They're found throughout the Mississippi River drainage. And so we have both in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I'm sure you've got them down there in Illinois too.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're warm water. They act a lot like a trout. They like really fast water. They feed on stuff that's drifting by. Um, they were the first fish I ever caught that I didn't know what it was. I love fishing since I was a kid, and I caught a mooneye, and this bright silver fish with this big eye jumped out of the muddy water, and I'd never seen anything like it. They're incredibly flat, incredibly metallic, shiny, super big eye. They have teeth on their tongue. They're bizarre.
I've never seen one. I have never seen one.
Yeah, they're right under your nose, probably, right?
Most of the carp, and I will admit, sometimes we do bow fish and we shoot carp. Not that many, and they're all the same species. I've never found any that are different, but
yeah. So yeah, and that's the buffalo sometimes get lumped in. People will call buffalo carp, which is probably the worst thing to ever happen to buffalo. And like I'm not anti-harvesting. I hunt, I fish, I eat fish. All I tell people is like you can harvest as many of these things as you want to eat, right? A good sized buffalo is going to feed your whole family more and your neighborhood, right? A 20-pound fish, it's like you really only need one. If we would stick to that sort of rule, we probably wouldn't need other limits. But that's not how regulations books work, right?
Right.
Regulations books, the CO can't follow you home and see how many, if you clear your plate. And so we're going to need limits that convey the value of these native fish, because they do more than just exist and feed people, which they do. But going back to the mooneye and the goldeye, they are also the only hosts for a federally endangered mussel that lives in the St. Croix River here between Minnesota and Wisconsin. Well, if you're going to protect this federally endangered species, you have to protect the host fish. Minnesota doesn't protect the mooneye or the goldeye, period. Even in this place where it might have a threatened species attached to its gills or a federally endangered species attached to its gills. The goldeye is threatened in the state of Wisconsin. So a goldeye on the border between these two states can vacillate between being completely protected and being completely unprotected as it swims left and right across the river. Which just shows that when I'm talking about these fish going from completely unregulated to being protected, I'm not making this up. I'm not going to lie. There are times when I lay awake in bed at night and go like, is this did I fall into like a conspiracy theory rabbit hole? Like,
I feel like that about everything anymore.
Right. But then when I have those moments, I bring up the first Fish Commission report from the Minnesota Historical Society, and I read what they said about these fish, about, being vermin of the waters and wanting to exterminate pickerel because they did nothing else but eat, other fish. And like it sounds like I have this conspiracy theory that the man is trying to hide a whole bunch of, warm water river fish from you, like moon eyes and gold eyes, except for the fact that they wrote it down and it's actually working because you'd never seen one before.
Yeah.
So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's something that's actually happening.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen one. If I have, I wouldn't have known what it was. And, I hardly even see any buffalo, which.
Well, bigmouth buffalo decline after historically and recently they've been in decline, facing after, especially with invasive species. They compete with silver and bighead carp, and so researchers have recently demonstrated with a combination of surveys, pond before and after treatments, and laboratory experiments, they've actually shown the mechanisms for why bigmouth buffalo decline after silver carp invade. So we have a fish here that is commercially important. It's actually the main fish that drives the inland commercial fisheries on the Mississippi River. So they are getting harvested and fed to people. And they face existential threat from invasive species. And to the best of my knowledge, most states have managed this by continuing to allow completely unlimited harvest. If you are really opposed to invasive species, well, then you should want native species, right? You should be building up, your reserves of native species, knowing that they're going to face threats from invaders that compete with them. To the best of my knowledge, no state has ever changed the way they manage native species pre-invasion by bighead or silver carp, which seems just insane, doesn't it? That you would see this like slow disaster coming, and you would have a commercial industry that depended on these fish, and your response would be to keep doing the same thing you've always done.
Well, it makes sense, right?
and then the people who, oftentimes people who harvest them, because they're rough fish and because the way the rough fish paradigm short circuits normal stakeholder-led conservation, these fish are devalued. So that then I end up having these conversations with people where they're saying, well, we're, quote, cleaning out the river or something. And I'm like, but no, these fish are actually filter feeders. They're doing the cleaning.
Yeah. So when you say bighead, is there like a distinction between like Asian carp and bighead?
So yeah, the silver carp and bighead carp are the invasive carps. And so then big mouth buffalo is the native sucker. Those are the ones that can live to be over 100 years old.
Okay.
So I wanted to be specific in the silver carp though, because the paper that I was referencing, they specifically were talking about silver carp. So
yeah, we face a big threat from the Asian carp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are subtypes of the. Yeah, those are both types of that category. So
they actually kill people. They kill people jumping out of the water and hit them when they're driving a jet ski or boats, or it's pretty common. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you've already got those invasive species have established, and now your native fish ecosystem is depleted. And, unfortunately, that's going to be hard to turn around. One of the principles of Native Fish for Tomorrow is the idea of conserving native or common species while they're common. It's really, there's this repeated history in fisheries of things being depleted, and then managers historically have been like, oh, well, we can bring them back. We'll bring them back with hatcheries or whatever, right? And it's like, that has never worked. Right. There's a very few cases where like sturgeon were completely wiped out of an ecosystem, and with intensive stocking 40 years later and no harvest and habitat restoration, we now have some sturgeon. But you can look at the billions of dollars that have been poured into the West Coast salmon and things like that and realize you never get that river so full of fish that you can walk across their backs again. And so it's not enough to preserve a few of these fish like Noah's Ark. You have to preserve enough of these fish that they can fulfill their ecosystem functions. They transport nutrients upstream when they spawn. They flip substrate when they feed. This creates habitat for other animals, right? Anyone who's fished a river or knows anything about riverine ecosystems, embedded sediment, when silt fills in the rock spaces in a river, that's death. The bugs don't have a place to hide. Fish don't have a place to lay eggs. Guess what? What are suckers doing? They're down there on the bottom. They're moving those rocks when they feed. I can see this with my naked eye from bridges on the Mississippi, where they'll leave lines of rocks that have been exposed. That's improving the habitat. You don't need a few fish just to say that you save them. You need enough fish in this river that they can flip those rocks and do that ecosystem function. And so then people say, oh, well, there's so many of them. It's like, well, yeah, there's supposed to be so many of them, right? Yeah. There's supposed to be nobody, when you hear the stories of salmon so thick you could walk across their back, nobody ever says there were too many.
Right. Same thing with herds of elk and deer throughout, the Midwest and everything that now don't exist, so and bison as
that's one thing in Minnesota, and it's particularly true now that they took the lake whitefish off and the eel pout lake herring off. A off of the rough list, all the species that are left are things that live in shallow water. Those are the ones they wanted to, somebody proposed taking gar off the list and people flipped out. Lake whitefish came up and got off the list and nobody cared. It's the ones you can see. And there's a human instinct that's like, if you can see something, well, then there's a lot of them, right?
Oh,
A blue ribbon trout stream might have 3,000 trout per mile, but nobody complains about that, even if they are an invasive species. You got 3,000 brown trout per mile. Nobody cares that they're from Germany,
yeah.
right? And so this double standard between your native and invasive fish dates back to really like the first time I could find rough-fish in statute was 1907. But between then and 1920s was really when this idea of this divide came into being, and was at a time when people had enough free time, prosperity, money to travel, to camp for recreation. And it was also when our cities got really big enough and water pollution got out of control. And so you're a rich person living in a city, the train advertised that they stocked trout at the end of the line. And you would buy a ticket. They would give free passage to the train cars that carried trout. You spent your hard-earned money. You took a vacation and you fished for trout in a pristine place. You turn around and you look back home at the people who were still fishing for food, because they weren't rich, and they were fishing in the pollution you'd left behind. And then outdoor writers connected fish and class. So Atlantic salmon is the king, trout is aristocracy. The bass, that's your like a blacksmith. That's your middle class. They're a brawler, a fighter. They're not refined though, right? But that's bass are a middle class fish. Catfish, that's a food fish for people who are poor. And if its mouth points straight down, it's actually below a catfish. Like that's like maybe an immigrant would eat it if they had to.
The bottom feeders, yeah.
Feeder.
Bottom feeders, yeah.
Right. But they just mapped class onto fish. And, then it was like, well, man, you do fish for suckers, right? Like we still carry some of that baggage today where people use fish to sort of create identity for themselves. And that I think is why people always insist on telling you what kind of fisherman they are. And sometimes they brag about how far they travel. And I'm kind of flipping that. I tell people I brag about how close to home I'm fishing. It's like I've been keeping track. I think I fished a little bit this afternoon. I think it was the 55th day I've been fishing this since open water.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because I'm fishing a mile from my house.
Yeah.
I'm fishing for buffalo. I'm fishing for red horse. I'm fishing with my kids. Because if you do fish catch and release, it really doesn't matter how many bones are in it. And if you're fishing for food, then you can sustainably harvest some red horse, a couple buffalo from most populations. And if you want something bony or boneless, just eat tofu. Okay. If you're going to eat meat, there's going to be bones in it. So, plan on that and use a food preparation that accounts for it.
Yeah.
But people drive, 4 hours to go fish for trout. They're going to let go anyway.
Well, that's like so that's the funniest thing, because if you tell people that you ate a buffalo or a sucker or something like that, they'll turn their nose up at you and be like, why would you eat that?
Mm-hmm.
But then in that same breath, if you told them that you eat a largemouth bass or a smallmouth bass, they look at you like you're a psychopath and a murderer and destroyed their, amazing population. And it's like, what's the difference? Well, why is one life of a fish greater than another if you're consuming it?
And biologically speaking, like an older fish, it's like, well, a big mouth buffalo is going to take 10 years to reach maturity and might live 127. Right. And I've had biologists in Minnesota tell me that they can't find a brook trout over 4 years old. That's like they max out.
Yeah.
So it's like one guy said you catch an 18-inch brook trout out of this particular stream, he's like, mount it. He's like, it's probably not going to live to spawn again.
No.
Right.
It-
Smallmouth bass, maybe 8 years, right?
yeah.
It's like, yeah, go for that. Eat those. But I mean, if you want to eat a buffalo, most populations you could harvest, a buffalo. Some of the populations in northern Minnesota are getting depleted, which we're concerned about. But in other places, they're still allowing a limited commercial harvest. If you eat one buffalo and you tell people and you save somebody from throwing 10 buffalo on the bank, it's a net gain. That's consumptive conservation, right? Nothing that people treat as a resource goes extinct, right?
Right.
We treat pheasants as a resource. We treat squirrels and deer as a resource. We treat trees as a resource. We manage them as a resource. We manage them for sustainability.
Respectively, I guess respectively, though, is the key to that. Because we have seen, utilized as a resource. I mean, the beaver, for instance, was utilized as a resource. However, they didn't respect it.
That maybe wasn't managed as much as it was just all out harvest. But but if we treat something as a resource as something that we want sustainably, right, and we're invested in it, that's stakeholder led conservation. That's why we have deer and turkeys and elk, and beavers and this system works. But for that system to work, we need people to go out and fish for them, eat a couple, maybe share them with friends. That's the beauty of it. It's like, well, they are out there, and I don't have to drive. I don't have to drive 4 hours. I can be out catching red horse that are close to 10 pounds, and I don't even have to, stand in an icy stream elbow to elbow with a bunch of people.
Yeah, I think honestly, some of my favorite fishing, and over the years, it's become even, a bigger part of what I do, is a small stretch of the river that my buddy lives on. Utilize it. I can just go right, launch from his backyard, and just jugging for catfish. I absolutely love that. That has quickly become one of my all-time favorite types of fishing to do, and it's just fun. It's fun.
That's like chasing tip-ups in open water. What I do is I fish with my kids a lot. They always want to go, but once again, it's a simple fishing. Like, we go to the Mississippi River, and it's fork sticks, it's worms, and especially if we have friends along, we just take turns, just round robin. Like, whose turn is it, right? You have 4 or 5 lines out, usually getting a bite, every couple minutes, and then one kid's got the net, another kid's got to reel it up. Sometimes I even get a turn. But everyone, I get partial credit for every fish that's caught. So, but then what we're catching small red horse, shorthead red horse are one of the smaller species. That's what's most abundant where we fish. They average 14 to 16, 17 inches, with like trophy class ones being 19 to 21. And I compare notes with people, and they're like, yeah, they were out on some popular river where they had to buy an extra tag to get fish that were that size, or 14 inches or smaller. And I'm like, well, you could come with me. You don't have to work as hard. You have to slow down, though. I think that's a little bit hard for American fishermen to do, because we have so much space. It's really easy to get this idea that, like, well, you can just go down the bank, and if it doesn't bite my favorite lure, then the next fish will. And so you've got space. Well, a lot of these fish would be game fish, except for the fact they don't bite lures. If they bit lures, then there'd be a market for selling gear to people for them. But most of these fish bite worms.
Yeah.
There's nothing to buy. Maybe some number 8 circle hooks.
See, that's not alluring to anybody. Nobody wants to bring the attention to that because they can't make money off of it, though.
Yeah.
That's where it's at.
Yeah, I'm never gonna get I'm not going to get sponsored on my Instagram. I'm never going to be a big time influencer because uh, there's no industry for that. I'm not going to sell so many number 8 circle hooks that
Right.
Gamakatsu is going to call me up and give me. I wouldn't even take a boat. I can't catch suckers from a rocking boat. I got to be able to see my rod tip tap. It's like, so yeah, I love the joke. I was like that I'm on the fork stick pro staff. It's like
Nice.
you cut your own fork stick, maybe get it out of buckthorn, like take out an invasive species.
There you go.
Dig up some night crawlers, maybe also an invasive species where you are. Like you make your own sinkers and go down to a river that's too warm for trout, but has a nice rocky bottom, and look for a spot with some current breaks and some rocks, and catch a sucker.
Nice. So,
Um,
so one thing I learned, and maybe you could use this, but black walnut hulls in a bucket of water, like a 5 gallon
oh,
bucket with a bunch of them, stir it up real good with a stick to where they start coming off of it and start staining the water with the tannins. If you dump that on the ground, you don't have to dig for night crawlers.
oh,
They all surface.
I'm not gonna lie to you though. I've bought like 24 dozen night crawlers so far this year. Um, so I can't actually dig or harvest enough in my
Yeah.
own yard to keep up.
You'd
I'm
probably get a
burnt.
few dozen though in one. It's
Yeah.
it's amazing how many come out of the ground, and I guess it's because the black walnut is actually an anti-parasitic slash dewormer, and it's actually forcing those worms to come up out of the ground. So
I
interesting.
I do know where there are some black walnut trees. So I
Yeah.
may that's but yeah, I like to take people fishing, and when you're putting out 4 to 6 rods at a time with you and your friends, you go through a lot of worms. So
Yeah.
but yeah, go down the river, and you gotta slow down. These fish don't chase their food like a bass does or a trout does. So you can't just work over a spot, in a minute and then, move on to the next spot. You have to slow down. That's great especially if you're fishing with kids. Because you don't have to worry about going anywhere. You can bring the minnow nets, you can bring the buckets, and you can bring a lawn chair, and still catch fish. Because when you find that spot, there's probably going to be a good number of fish there. If you find the good habitat, good riffle with a lot of bugs on the rocks, you should be able to fish there for hours and not get bored. You don't have to cover the whole river looking just for the aggressive fish. So, yeah, and I want everyone to go out. I figure if everyone's fishing somewhere in their backyard, somewhere close to home, then every backyard will have a steward, have a stakeholder in it, who will and you'll care, about pollution in your watershed if you're going to eat fish out of that watershed. If we only aspire to protecting those spots that were prioritized by the trains, right?
Yeah.
By like that idea that nature's far away, we're missing a lot of stuff that's really close right under our nose.
Yeah. So where do you typically, like, what is the habitat you're looking for when you are fishing? And then,
Rocks.
okay.
Yeah. Like you're looking for, generally speaking, like you're going to find your best stuff, faster current where you're getting the silt and the sediment swept off those rocks, so you have that nice clean cobble. Now, we all know you want to fish current breaks, right? You find your predatory species like right on that current break, right? They want to ambush. And you find your catfish and your freshwater drum like in the slow water of that eddy. Those are the fish that are real lazy. They're waiting for the river to deliver a meal right to them. A lot of the sucker species you find in really fast water. Like I didn't catch a lot of suckers until I started fishing on the outside of the break, and really working like that faster current where you think, oh, there's nothing going to be out there because they're going to have to work so hard to stay in the current. Well, that's also where the food is in a river. That's where the
Right.
bugs are
It's
living on
pushing
their
it. Yeah.
rocks. And so, like, I don't get out of bed for less than a half an ounce sinker. Um, and I carry like half ounce, ounce, and ounce and a half. I run 15-pound braid line that gives me a thinner diameter so I can use less weight to hold. And I'm still using an ounce, just day to day. So the mistake I see people make is using like split shot, or smaller sinkers. And if you're fishing in that eddy at that like point where the water's still with a couple split shot, you're gonna get freshwater drum. They're pretty cool fish. Good to eat. They eat a lot of zebra mussels though, so I usually let them go to keep eating zebra mussels. You'll get your catfish. But if you really will target that fast, those current breaks, riffly areas with those rocky bottoms where you're like afraid of getting snagged, slinky sinkers, 1 ounce pencil sinkers, put it out there. Don't move it. If you move it, like you're just gonna move it until you find a snag. So like put it out there, make sure you can feel the bottom when it taps, and then just wait for a sucker to come find that.
Really? So how long do you leave like the sinker from the line? Do you give it like a foot
foot to 2 feet?
Okay.
If your worm's getting like picked off and you're not noticing bites, your leader's probably a little too long.
Okay.
And if it's you're not getting bites at all, maybe it's a little too short. But around a foot's pretty good. If I'm sight fishing, maybe we'll go a little bit longer because I don't want the fish to see the sinker moving with the worm. But for putting red horse on the bank, for putting short heads on the bank to go into fish sticks, sitting on the bank of the Mississippi with a forked stick and letting the kids catch minnows and crayfish and
yeah. So
yeah.
One of the things you mentioned kind of about habitat, and I don't know if you're familiar with like the Greater Kankakee Marsh or know anything about that.
No, I don't.
So it was like this wonderful stretch of the Kankakee River that went from Indiana to Illinois, and they came to an agreement that they were going to clear cut a bunch of it. And it had all these backwaters and sloughs and backflows and just really cool habitat with really mature timber on it. And they had an agreement that they were going to clear cut it and use it for transportation of goods between the two states. So they both started clear cutting a large section of it and straightening the river out instead of having all those curves and flows. And Indiana pretty much did clear cut it all the way to the Illinois border, and the last second Illinois backed out of the deal. So there's a small section of that marsh that's still preserved at the wetland section right on the Indiana-Illinois border today.
Cool.
What sucks, and I do mean sucks, is how you talked about the silt and sediment filling it in. Well, Indiana started to do a good job, but all the residual that came by is all piling up on all these curves of this river and creating a huge problem. And so I think maybe that's partially why some of these fish that I am not familiar with, I do not see because they don't exist in that area because they can't survive.
No, and it's that's one of the things, and it's another communication challenge we have with native fish conservation, right? Particularly like we're talking about these fish that have a history of being maligned because they don't bite lures, because they're associated with warm water, which in warm water rivers are associated with urban pollution and people who would can't afford to buy fish at the grocery store. And so but so you have that issue, and then you have the diversity issue where you have to be like, you have to explain that there's, in Minnesota alone, there's 26 species that are on this list. Wisconsin's got their own list, and you've got to explain that some of these fish are legitimately threatened and you cannot eat one, and that the other ones are abundant and you can eat them. And then the third problem communicating them is that oftentimes they're locally abundant and then completely missing from other places. And so like the mooneye and goldeye might be very abundant in another watershed. And the people over there are like, oh yeah, we use them for catfish bait. Oh, we can't keep them off, your lines. And then that leads to this idea that they're just abundant everywhere. Minnesota did a study where they looked at fish distributions above and below dams to see how dams were impacting fish distributions. And they found freshwater drum, which is a fish that I at one point was like, I'm so tired of catching freshwater drum, right? Freshwater drum in Minnesota were missing above 60% of the dams that they looked at. That's 60% of their possible range like they're missing from, but then when you do find them, you usually find 100, right?
They've got nowhere else to go. That's
Right. And then the problem is then people are like, well, I hate freshwater drum, which is completely unfair. I mentioned before they're cool fish. They're delicious. They taste like their saltwater cousins. They're related to redfish in on the Gulf, right? Everybody loves to eat redfish. Um, Freshwater drum are the freshwater version of that. They eat zebra mussels. Over half their diet can be zebra mussels where they're abundant. So that's like an awesome thing. Nobody likes zebra mussels. They are also host to 11 species of native mussels. So they're a native mussel's best friend, and native mussels are the most endangered group of animals in the country. And freshwater drum can live to be 75 years old. So they're this great resource, and because they're hyper abundant in some places, they get a bad rap.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to explain, well, actually, we need to, if we could do some dam removals, we actually want freshwater drum in more places.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of common. When you tell people you eat catfish, they kind of even look at you, unless it's like, oh, well, where'd you get it? Was it, farm raised somewhere where it was? And it's like, no, it's a river cat. And people are like, you eat river cats? Like they're looking down upon you for eating a river cat, and it's like
that's got to be a Midwest thing.
Yeah, I don't get it. And I mean, to me, I love a big chunk of white catfish meat. Yeah,
it wasn't that long ago. I actually kept a catfish. Was the first time I'd ever actually eaten one as a Minnesotan.
Really?
Yeah, like I mean, I grew. We ate bullheads. From southern. I was from southern Minnesota. We ate a few bullheads. But I was in this. Sort of awkward situation where I was actually keeping red horse for a fish fry, and I caught a catfish and I'm about to let it go. And then I was like, I don't have dinner plans for tonight. This fish fry is for tomorrow. And I was like, well, I should probably eat this catfish. But, for me now, I eat more red horse than I eat anything else.
That's interesting. Honestly, I don't even know if I've even seen a red horse or not.
So yeah, in Minnesota we have 6 different species of red horse. Nationally, there's 27 species, and they're a fascinating group of suckers. And some of them have these amazing stories. The robust red horse was thought to be extinct until it was rediscovered. So it was missing for 100 years. That's how rare they are. There's one in Canada called the copper red horse that's endangered in Canada. It's only found in a few rivers. The sicklefin red horse, I believe it's from Tennessee. That one actually hasn't been described as a species yet. Yeah, I believe they're working on the scientific description of it. And that one, they called it, there was a fantastic podcast from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service they did about it, and they interviewed people. They're talking about these were salmon of the Appalachians. Like these fish migrate upstream, and indigenous people, First Nations people, would harvest them in the springtime, like when they were available. That's, it's almost like we forgot that there was a time when fish was just food and didn't have any other baggage associated with it, right? Like, there was a time when you ate what you could catch. In Minnesota, one of our counties is called Candy-Ojai County. There's a bottled water that has the same name. It has this beautiful flow to it. Candy-Ojai. Sounds magical. That is the Lakota Dakota word for the place where the buffalo fish come.
Nice.
Right.
So
that was the name of the headwaters of the Crow River. And so, but, we've forgotten that this was like, this was just a seasonal resource. Like this is where they come to spawn. This is a region that's important. So then there's Buffalo Lake in Minnesota. That's named for the fish. The town of Buffalo in Minnesota, named for the fish through the lake. And now because of the bison, before I can have a conversation with people about conserving big mouth buffalo in Minnesota or buffalo fish in general, I have to convince them it's a fish. Right? I have to, it's like, I'm not even on the conservation field yet. when people think that if I'm fishing for buffalo, I'm joking. Like, no, I'm legit fishing for buffalo. It's a fish.
But if you told them you're carp fishing, they'd be like, "Oh, okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
then they wouldn't talk to me.
yeah." So,
But no,
like the red horse that you talk about, that is it. Pretty much just like uh, the the fins are different color. Like, what distinguishes that from every other sucker?
yeah. So the red horse group, they have really metallic scales. It's probably actually the thing that you notice first when if you see a red horse in the water versus like a white sucker.
Mm.
So like, and this is the sucker group is incredibly diverse. If you're a species chaser or you just appreciate native ecosystems, I do a lot of fishing like people do bird watching. Which is always funny because when I tell people that I'm trying to catch a river red horse and it's a fish I can't even eat because they are threatened, and they say why, and I'm like, why do you look at eagles? Like you can't eat those either.
Well, you could.
I mean, legally.
Right, right.
Um, the so the red horse group, they have very metallic scales. They're all very shiny. And but some of them have red tails. Some of them have silver tails. This causes lots of confusion with people because then they're like, well, it's not a red horse because it doesn't have a red tail. And they're like, actually, half of them don't. A field guide I like the Peterson's field guide. There's others as well. A field guide is a great resource for this. Minnesota alone has 165 species of fish. 143 of them are native. I know Wisconsin and Illinois have even more. So a good rule of thumb, though, is if you catch something and you don't recognize it, you probably shouldn't eat it.
Correct. Yeah, that's...
But you can familiarize yourself. I'm going to plug also moxostoma.com is a great resource. They have ID sheets. I believe that's based in Illinois. They have an ID cheat sheet that you can fold up inside your wallet and it gives you all the characteristics you need to tell the common red horse apart. And so if you catch a sucker and it's got bigger scales than the typical sucker and they're metallic and iridescent, it's probably a red horse. And then you want to know which kind before you eat it. I recommend eating the short-head red horse and the golden red horse. Those ones are apparently shorter lived, so they're more sustainable to harvest.
Interesting. So speaking of harvesting and stuff like that, what are you doing when you catch these fish? I mean, how are you cooking them? What's that look like?
So my family's favorite thing is homemade fish sticks. So I kill them. I catch one. I bleed it. Put it on ice right away.
What's the importance of bleeding them?
I don't like my fish soaking in a hot river.
Okay.
So I want them cool down. I want to kill them humanely. So I bleed them and I put them on ice. And then I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna fillet them out right away. And then if you're gonna make fish sticks or fish patties or you're gonna grind them, you just fillet them just like you would a walleye. Go over your ribs, skin them. You're not going to worry about any pin bones or Y bones. Then I run them through the meat grinder. I just use a hand crank meat grinder. I don't want to dig out my half horsepower, or whatever. I'm just, doing a batch of fish sticks. I just use a hand crank meat grinder. I use the rawfish.com fish patty recipe. It's some, 2 cups of fish, half a cup of saltines, an egg, tablespoon of mayonnaise, 2 teaspoons of Old Bay seasoning, little parsley. Mix it up. At that point, you can make a patty. We have a sucker burger. You can make a ball, deep fry it, and make a sucker ball. But if you're trying to impress people, maybe like elevate it a little bit, put the sausage stuffing attachment back on your meat grinder. Run the mix through again and make it into a stick. Roll it in panko breadcrumbs. You're going to fry this for 3 minutes, not more, because then you don't want it to dry out. If you feel like you're reaching for the tartar sauce, it's overdone. It's dry. Like you want it still moist in the middle. Not to say that a little yum yum sauce isn't good, but um, maybe a squeeze of lemon, and it'll be the best fish sticks you ever had.
So, like, you're not worried at all about the bones at that point because you put
Nope.
them through the meat grinder, or what how?
Yeah, you just grind them once.
Okay.
Like, you only need to grind them once. I only go through again because that's how I get them through the sausage stuffing attachment.
Okay. Now I've got a buddy that he takes them and pressure cans them, and he says the
Yeah.
bones basically dissolve in the
Yep.
pressure canning.
Yep. You, pickle them, can them, ceviche. Basically just have some sort of some way to deal with the bones. If you're doing a lot and you're doing a fish fry, you can take the bellies off. Like the bottom half of like the front of the fillet is boneless, and so we did a big fish fry get together this spring, and we took the bellies off and fried those separate, and then made fish cakes out of the rest of them. But we were feeding like 50 people or something. So, but yeah, just you go through the grinder once. There you go. I mean, that's your like salmon burger or a fish stick. If you're hard up, right, you can't catch suckers. You can always do it with pike.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, in the winter we just take our hammer handled pike and we make fish sticks. But
so you don't just pickle them? Like, that's the only way I ever see people do it is just pickled pike. And it's like that doesn't appeal to me. It
requires a lot of. If I could have pickled pike in a couple days, or I could have fish sticks now,
I'd take the fish sticks for sure.
Yeah, just to make the fish sticks. So, but yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing. And honestly, the red horse meat is white. I've fed fish sticks to people on camera. I've fed red horse to people to Joe Cermelli on his former meat eater show. And yeah, everybody's like, this tastes like a white fish, and I'm like, that's because it's a white meat fish.
It's just considered trash, but
right. It eats off the bottom like everything else in the river too.
Yeah.
One of my favorite photos of all time is a brown trout that his mouth is full of red horse eggs, and the trout was caught on a worm on the bottom. And so you have a. So what do you have there? You've got a bottom feeding German fish that's eating the eggs of a native species. And it's like, that's literally everything suckers are accused of, right? Like in one photo.
So, one of the things I thought of was like, you talked about doing them that way, and I've had carp, don't even know what kind, but they brined it and smoked it, and it was horrible. It wasn't that good. That just doesn't seem like a good way to do it.
And carp is I think is an oilier meat and a redder meat.
It looked like a can of tuna that you would open up,
right?
But tasted way worse.
Yeah, and suckers are just not like that at all.
Yeah.
There's a lot of white meat on every sucker I've ever cleaned. Like they all like, and now like I donate the heads to Alec Blackman, the scientist who's done so much the aging research that's discovered bigmouth buffalo can live to be over 100 years old. So I'll keep fish, never more than I'm going to eat. But I keep fish and then like donate the heads to him. And because eating red horse is, both for science and my family loves fish sticks, and then it's also it's a consumptive conservation action. Because then when people say you can't eat those, I can say I just did. And so I've cleaned quite a few of them. We've made fish sticks at least 3 or 4 times so far this year. And yeah, they're all of them shorthead, silver, red horse, golden red horse, white suckers. Actually there was in a Minnesota paper this spring we photographed with a stringer of suckers, and the author took home suckers and made sucker patties himself for the article. So
interesting.
Yeah, that's
So do you ever cook them any other way? Have you ever tried to take them and like shallow fry them or anything
I've
like
also
that?
had them. I've also had them. There's a trick. You can also cross hatch them. You want to make cuts really close together, and then, like your buddy was saying with the pressure cooking, dealing with bones, you want to get your cuts close enough together and roll them in a little bit of cornmeal, or I like Wonder Flour for a little fish breading. Gives it like almost a tempura sort of crispiness of batter, but the thinness of breading with the Wonder Flour. Fry them hot in oil. You kind of cross hatch them both sides, and that'll soften those bones. Um, so if you don't want to get out the meat grinder,
Right.
but yeah, I get more requests for fish sticks. So
I like it.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll have to
yeah,
try it. Maybe I'll have to go find some somewhere. But
well,
yeah,
hey, and if you do, here's the other thing too, right? Is because then sometimes people will, uh, maybe give me a little flack about like, well, I'm only catching suckers or something. And it's like, I can catch, whatever. Like I do lake trout in the spring. I go to the Boundary Waters to do a wilderness lake trout trip. I catch bass if nobody's looking. I catch pike in the winter. But the fish that are really keep me interested and like keep me coming back as an angler are these fish that don't chase lures, right? Like these are fish that you need to have a fine presentation to because they're not motivated to go chase something down, right? You've got to drop it right on their nose because there's a lot of other bugs for them to eat in the river, right?
yeah.
They're not waiting for one meal a day that you're going to, trick them into having. And so like those are the fish actually that I find the most interesting as an angler. You got to slow down. You got to be finesse. You got to be like on your game a little bit. You got to be in the right spot, or you're going to wait a long time for a sucker to do it. So I encourage everyone to go out and like give these fish a little bit of a fresh look as an angling challenge as well. And you might actually be like surprised, like I'll get messages on Instagram when somebody gets a red horse or a sucker on the fly rod, and it's like, that's a great accomplishment. And they'll tell me, they're like, I got however many trout today. I've got however many, whatever. I got a sucker. Right.
So how are they catching them on the fly then? Like, what's the practice there? What are they doing that actually appeals to them that they can get it in front of them?
If you're if you have perfect conditions and you can see, like they will turn to look at something, they will like be visually curious. They have a lot of taste buds on their lips, and so they expect their food to taste good. So most of the time they won't take a fly. Sometimes they're aggressive and you get lucky, and they'll turn and take it and like hit something that's like has to be going pretty slow on the bottom. You probably have to be able to see their reaction to know that they're doing it. But I think it speaks to the fact that these fish are actually challenging to catch. They're actually fun to target because you can't catch every one. Like that's, it's like I use worms because I wouldn't catch any if I didn't.
Yeah.
Some fish take finesse, some fish take some bait, and some fish take both.
Yeah. Now it makes me wonder. I have a creek in my backyard. It's always got water in it flowing. It's low now. Well, it was low because we were in a pretty serious drought, but I've never seen any in there. But then again, I've never looked for them, and chances are they're in the deeper edge of the faster moving water. So that's probably why I've never seen them.
Could also be very seasonal. So like in the springtime, water's usually a little muddier and higher and harder to see, right?
Yep.
That's all. One thing all different suckers have in common is they all migrate, which makes them more susceptible to dams as far as like habitat degradation and impacting their populations. But some of these native suckers, like the blue sucker, can migrate 300 miles.
Holy cow. That's
right.
Impressive.
So even I know personally from fishing one river over the course of a summer, a wadable river, that they're like silver red horse there in the spring and they're gone in the summer all the way out, right? That's a 10-mile stretch. So your little stream in your backyard might have suckers for the spawning season right away in the spring. You might have 2 weeks or something like that where you've got the best sucker fishing right in your backyard. But those same fish, even, a short migrating species, they might be going back 5-10 miles back to a larger river for the rest of the summer and then the winter. And then they're going to migrate all the way back up from those wintering deep holes out on a main river, a larger river. It might migrate back all the way up to your backyard to spawn when the water's high, and you're not even
Don't even know it. Yeah.
Yeah, because you never put a worm in there when the water was high and muddy.
Honestly, never have. Never have. And I don't fish it enough, to be honest. I should just wander out there more than I do. And it's crazy that I'll travel
every backyard
10 minutes to go fish on the river versus the creek that's in my backyard. Yeah.
If you can't see the bottom, there's definitely a chance that there's a sucker in there. And if you can see the bottom, look very carefully for a sucker, because like some of the species, hog suckers, and I think it's northern hog suckers there, they'll sit on rocks and their head is almost shaped like a rock, and they're black and brown. They're colored like a rock, and they'll let you almost trip over them before they move.
No kidding.
They're probably the strangest looking fish. Their forehead is a little bit concave, and you look at them and you realize they have kind of the same shape of like an F1 race car, where they're intended to have like downforce, so they can sit in that fast water and it just pushes them onto the bottom, and they don't have to expend any energy to move.
Nice. Yeah.
And then they look like a rock sitting still there. And I don't know, I fished for one of those for like a couple of years. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't catch one. And then it's like, oh, I have to fish the raging torrent over there.
No kidding. Yeah. No, first time I ever saw catfish in there was just recently. So it was like 2 weeks ago. The water was lower, so some of the pools were a little bit shallower, and probably a 4-pound cat in there. So there's got to be something.
Oh yeah, I bet there's a sucker of some different kind in there. Like,
see, now I need to go print out a sheet, try and catch one, ID it, and see what the heck it is.
Yeah. No, and then you're gonna be like, realizing that there's a window to it, and like there's a seasonality to it, and then you start getting tuned into, there's a whole phenology to it. And like I had a friend, we would fish together, but then like she was bigger into mushrooms, and so like I'd lose her as soon as the morels started coming up. Then the fishing was good, and then she wouldn't join me anymore because like the mushrooms are.
You know what? To me, the morels are almost like a trash fish. No, I'm just kidding. But these days, I shouldn't say that. They're like something, but I don't care about them anymore because everybody wants to go out after them. There's so much competition, and there's so many other ones out there that now fascinate me because I can't find them. They elude me, and I want to go after them. So
I have to tell you that does put you at risk for becoming a sucker angler.
I'm a sucker for suckers then.
Yeah, you may. That's definitely a risk factor. That sounds like something I've said. Like, I'm so tired of catching all these bass. I think, or fishing behind the seventh person who's out after bass, and now. But hey, what do you know? There's a whole bunch of suckers here that won't bite.
Yeah, let's get them.
Yeah, let's figure this one out. So
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So Tyler, it's been awesome talking to you. I appreciate you truly coming on and sharing your knowledge for this episode. And
man, we just scratched the surface. I mean,
we'll have to probably have you back on, and we'll go into further detail if.
I'm dying to know what's in your backyard, though. Like, you have a creek in your backyard, and you haven't. Oh man, like
I rarely fish it. I took out the fly rod for the first time in the creek last year, and I thought it was so cool. I caught a little tiny smallmouth the size of like a dollar bill, and on like a 4-weight rod, I think, and it was awesome.
Yeah. So. No, like that's the one of my favorite places to fish, though, and it's for river red horse. They're threatened species. I had to get a permit just to be able to catch and release them. And it's a great bass fishery. It's a great, it's a great bass fishery, but the red horse get to be 28 inches long. The smallies don't.
No, they don't. No, they don't. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah.
And you catch so many smallies when you're sucker fishing. So yeah, try the same thing, but put a worm on your fly rod. I'm telling you, Like that's like
That's
black magic right there.
Really?
Let me tell you.
Okay. All right. So then you have to utilize a sinker though, right? On the fly rod?
If you fish it like a center pin, but or just spinning rod. I have definitely caught buffalo using a worm instead of a fly. Feels pretty transgressive, but if you start just fishing worms though, in a smallmouth creek like that, you're going to be catching so many smallmouth, and you'll also catch other things. Like that's the fun part about it, and that's why one of the things it's great about fishing the river is you set the hook and you literally never know.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if people want to find you, get more information, look up the nonprofit, try and maybe help out or do something, where can they find all that stuff?
We have a great website, nativefishfortomorrow.org. Our nonprofit is also on Instagram, nativefish, the number 4 for tomorrow, Native Fish for Tomorrow. I'm on Instagram, Buffalo_catcher. That's a great place to follow me, find me. I love to answer questions about sucker fishing, and I also bowfin and gar and moon eye and freshwater drum and all of that. I appreciate it as a person who grew up loving all sorts of other fish and getting a lot of flack for that and pushing back on this idea of junk fish. The outpouring and support of being invited onto podcasts like this and making the progress with the no junk fish bill in Minnesota and stuff like that, it never stops being super meaningful to me. Every little bit of support, honestly, I feel like it means 10 times much more to me because we started from zero. And so it really helps. The thing is to motivate managers and to motivate legislators and everybody involved in this process. It literally what we need is public attention. And so it's maybe sounds corny or whatever, but like likes, comments, I mean, like that literally that's where we're at now, where name recognition and public support makes a difference for these things. Because then I can go to meetings and I can say these, everyone wants this to happen. These people support this.
No, I think that's great. And the fact that you're pushing for that, and honestly, that mindset overflows into everything. And I don't know how all these things have gotten such a stigma that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy to think that somehow, some way, it got lost when they were all connected to us, whether it was the fish or even plants. I mean, you look at like milkweed or even lamb's quarter that grows everywhere is way more nutritious than any type of spinach you could possibly buy in the store.
Yeah.
It's free and abundant everywhere, especially in your garden.
Yep.
And people are like, "Oh, it's a weed. You got to spray it." Why?
we should have opened with that. Yeah. That's the whole thing, right? Like, if you understand that weeds aren't weeds, then you understand that trash fish aren't trash fish, right? Because it's like the same mentality of replacing a native thing with something that someone 100 years ago said was better, right? Like, pull this lamb's quarter because you're planting spinach. And it's like, and that's a backwards way to do it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Same thing applies to fish. That's where we should have started.
Well, we're here now. And I think
we got there.
I think that's a great conclusion, though. I mean, really, what better way to wrap it up? Because it's true. I mean, we just need to bring attention to other people, and hopefully this does that. So
right. Native ecosystems are superior to invasive ones.
Absolutely.
If it's terrestrial or aquatic.
Yep. 100%. It's been awesome
there you go.
Talking to you. Have a wonderful night, man.
It's my pleasure.
And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.